I was always the backup plan, never the priority. My parents skipped my graduation for my brother's soccer game. Now they're hurt I didn't invite them to my wedding. But I finally put myself first. For once. The air was thick with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial as I packed the final invitation into the crisp ivory envelope, my name embossed in silver at the top. A name that had so often felt like an afterthought on the lips of those who should have cherished it most. There was a tangible weight in the simple act of sealing each envelope, a gravity born not of excitement, but of quiet defiance. I was constructing a world where I was not a footnote. I was not the silent echo trailing behind someone else's applause. I was the headline, the centerpiece, the vivid brushstroke across a blank canvas I had decided, finally, to paint for myself. It was a strange kind of liberation, tinged with an ache I could not completely sever from my bones. I had always known, in that unspoken language only a neglected child understands, that my presence was optional, while my brother's was a necessity. His laughter was a symphony they orchestrated their lives around. My achievements were quiet tapers extinguished by the wind of their indifference. Recitals where I scanned the audience, heart trembling with hope, only to find empty chairs where their faces should have been. Birthdays where promises melted into thin, brittle excuses. School plays where I delivered lines to a crowd that never included them, my voice striving to fill a chasm they could not be bothered to cross. The final betrayal, the moment the floor caved beneath my careful balancing act of patience and yearning, came on a warm, sticky afternoon in June. I stood in my cap and gown, the honor cords heavy around my neck, a tangible testament to years of gritted teeth and late nights spent chasing a kind of validation that would never arrive. I remember glancing towards the rows of proud parents, searching, yearning, pleading with the universe to see just one familiar face. All I found was absence. Their seats were vacant, claimed by silence, and the unwavering understanding that I was not, and never had been, enough to matter. Later, when I learned they had been at my brother's soccer game, cheering, laughing, throwing their arms around him in jubilant celebration of yet another goal, scored in an endless parade of small victories, something fundamental within me fractured. It wasn't rage that bloomed in my chest that day, but a hollowness so vast it devoured any lingering scraps of innocence I had clung to. That was the moment I realized I had been playing a rigged game my entire life, one where the rules demanded I give everything and expect nothing in return. In the years that followed, I learned to wear my invisibility like armor. I did not confront them. I did not rage or plead or ask why. I simply drifted away, the current of my own ambitions and quiet sorrows carrying me further from the shoreline of their expectations. I built a life brick by brick, hand by trembling hand, constructing a sanctuary where my worth was no longer contingent on their fleeting approval. I met Daniel in the most unassuming way. Coffee shop on a rainy afternoon, the kind of encounter that feels at once mundane and touched by fate. He saw me, not just the surface-level pleasantries or the curated image I had grown so adept at presenting to the world. He saw the wounds I tried to hide, the fractures I patched with brittle smiles. And more importantly, he stayed. Through every guarded conversation, every hesitant reveal, every scar laid bare, he stayed. When he knelt before me one dusky evening, the setting sun casting molten gold across the horizon, ring trembling between his fingers, I realized that I was someone's choice, not their obligation, not their fallback plan, but their wholehearted, unhesitating choice. Planning the wedding was a strange, bittersweet experience. Each decision, the flowers, the music, the guest list, became a battlefield between past and present. I wanted, desperately, to erase the echoes of all the times I had been overlooked. I wanted to fill this day with people who had seen me, who had chosen me, who had loved me without stipulations or conditions. The invitations sat in a neat stack on the kitchen counter, a testament to this new life I was forging. One name was conspicuously absent. Two names, actually, and it was not an oversight. It was a choice as deliberate as it was painful. When my mother called, her voice brittle with unspoken grievances, I answered with a heart steady in its resolve. "We heard from Aunt Carol that you're getting married," she said, the accusation laced beneath the carefully composed words. "Why didn't you tell us?" I could have unleashed the avalanche of years buried in my chest, the missed milestones, the hollow birthdays, the vacant seats. But I knew it would be like shouting into a void. Instead, I replied, my voice steady, even gentle, I didn't think you'd be interested. You usually have other priorities. A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, a wounded silence that might have once shattered me. How could you be so cruel? She whispered, as if my act of self-preservation was the ultimate betrayal. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, the way she clutched at her wounded pride, oblivious to the years I had spent bleeding in silence. But laughter felt cheap in the face of such profound sorrow, so I simply ended the call, letting the dial tone wash over me like a benediction. They tried to reach out after that, text messages steeped in guilt, voicemails thick with tears. I didn't feel the gravitational pull to respond, to soothe, to explain away my boundaries as if they were offenses I needed to apologize for. I had spent a lifetime setting myself on fire to keep them warm. It was time to choose myself, to bask in the warmth of my own hard-won light. As the wedding day drew closer, the final fittings, tastings and rehearsals passing in a flurry of joyful chaos, I found myself reflecting not with bitterness but with a bittersweet clarity. I did not wish them harm. I did not wish them pain. I simply wished for distance, for a life where their absence was not a wound but a freedom. Standing before the mirror in my wedding dress, the delicate lace a second skin molded to my frame, I hardly recognized the woman staring back at me. Her eyes, once hollowed by disappointment, now burned with a quiet, steadfast fire. Her shoulders, once bowed under the crushing weight of unmet expectations, now squared with the dignity of self-worth. I had waited so long for them to see me, to choose me, to love me in the ways I had begged for without words. But the truth was, I had needed to see myself all along. I had needed to choose myself, love myself, fight for myself in ways they never would. And on that day, surrounded by friends who had become family, by love that had grown resilient and true, I knew that I was not a backup plan. I was not an afterthought. I was not the echo of someone else's triumphs. I was the author of my own story. The morning sun crept languidly through the half-drawn curtains, casting muted shafts of gold across the polished wood floors, a quiet testament to the calm I had learned to cultivate inside the life I was building. Each footstep through my apartment felt deliberate, measured, as though even the air respected the silence I had earned after years of chaotic, hollow noise. The discarded, unmailed invitations to my parents sat atop the oak desk in my study, untouched, unsent, and heavy with meanings no postage stamp could ever bear. They were a symbol of a severance I had once thought would destroy me, but now realized was simply a shedding of old, ill-fitting skins. Daniel moved about in the kitchen, humming some forgotten melody under his breath, his presence filling the space in a way that never demanded attention, only offered it. I watched him for a moment, unseen, marveling at how the simplest gestures could now anchor me when once I had drifted aimlessly, untethered by any true sense of belonging. He glanced up and caught my gaze, offering a smile that asked nothing and promised everything all at once. In that smile lived a universe where I was not required to earn love through sacrifice or silence. The wedding plans continued unabated, a kind of joyous tempest that whirled around me, dress fittings that stretched into endless afternoons, cake tastings where laughter spilled freely, flower arrangements debated with animated fervor. Every detail stitched itself into the tapestry of a day meant to celebrate not just union, but triumph, reclamation, a hard-won battle for selfhood. Still, amidst the flurry of appointments and decisions, the ghost of my parents' absence lingered at the edges of my mind, whispering doubts like old, familiar lullabies. Some evenings, when the house grew quiet and Daniel drifted into sleep, I would find myself wandering into the study, drawn to the untouched invitations as though they were relics of a bygone era, artifacts of a grief I had never fully excavated. I would trace the edge of the envelopes with trembling fingers, feeling the sharp sting of a question that refused to die. Was I being cruel? Was my silence an act of justice, or was it just another mirror of the neglect I had endured? But the more I sat with those questions, the clearer the answer became. Mercy for those who had consistently abandoned me was not a virtue. It was another form of self-betrayal. In choosing not to send those invitations, I was not erasing them from my story. I was simply acknowledging the truth, that they had already written themselves out of the chapters that mattered most. Word spread among extended family like wildfire racing through dry brush. Calls and messages poured in, some thick with disbelief, others weighted with thinly veiled accusations. I became, in the span of mere days, the black sheep, the wayward daughter, the selfish bride who had dared to place her own healing above the expectations of a family that had never truly been mine to rely upon. It was almost laughable, the sudden attention lavished upon me by those who had once barely registered my existence beyond obligatory holiday gatherings. I received a particularly scathing voicemail from my aunt, her words dripping with the kind of sanctimonious judgment reserved for those who had never known the hollow thud of footsteps walking away at your moment of need. "Family is everything," she admonished, as though the mere label absolved decades of neglect, as though blood alone had the power to heal wounds carved deep by indifference. I deleted the message without listening to the end, feeling no triumph, only a kind of weary certainty. The day of the final dress fitting arrived with the gentle ferocity of a storm, long predicted but no less overwhelming in its arrival. My best friend Lena accompanied me, her excitement a palpable, effervescent energy that wrapped around my quieter, steadier joy. Standing on the small pedestal in the center of the boutique, surrounded by mirrors reflecting infinite versions of myself, I felt an almost dizzying sense of convergence. The girl who had once waited alone in auditoriums, the teenager who had read award certificates aloud to an empty kitchen, the woman who now stood tall, radiant, unapologetically present. The dress was a vision of delicate rebellion, intricate lace that kissed the curve of my shoulders, a bodice that whispered of strength beneath its softness, a flowing skirt that seemed to laugh in the face of gravity itself. It was not a dress chosen to impress anyone but myself, a stark departure from the years I had spent molding my desires into shapes that would fit more comfortably into other people's expectations. As Lena dabbed at the corner of her eyes, laughing at her own sentimentality, I caught my own reflection once more and realized with startling clarity that I was not mourning their absence anymore. I was mourning the version of myself who had once believed their absence was a verdict on her worth. That girl deserved her mourning. She deserved her elegy. But she did not deserve to follow me into this new chapter, weighted down by grief that no longer served her. Later that evening, as twilight bled into the deep indigo of night, Daniel and I sat curled together on the worn leather couch, the wedding playlist humming softly in the background. He traced slow, aimless patterns across the back of my hand, grounding me in a moment so simple it felt sacred. "They called again today," I said, the words escaping before I could decide whether to share them. "My mother left a voicemail." Daniel's hand stilled, his thumb pressing lightly against my knuckle in silent support. He did not rush to offer advice, did not fill the space with reassurances. He simply waited, letting me choose how much I wanted to give. "I didn't listen to it," I continued after a beat. "I didn't need to. I know what it says, that I'm being cruel, that I'm hurting them." He shifted to face me more fully, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You're not responsible for their feelings," he said simply, not as consolation, but as truth. "You're allowed to protect your peace." The simplicity of his words struck something deep within me, something raw and trembling and long denied. I nodded, the gesture small but suffused with a determination that vibrated through every fiber of my being. I was not the villain in this story, nor was I the damsel abandoned by the castle gates. I was simply a woman who had finally stopped begging for scraps at a table where she had never been welcome. The days spiraled forward, each one pulling me closer to the threshold of a new beginning. There were moments, fleeting and sharp, when doubt crept in like a cold draft under a closed door. Memories surfaced unbidden. My mother braiding my hair for picture day, my father teaching me how to ride a bike. Small, tender mercies that stood in stark contrast to the vast landscape of absence that had followed. It would have been easier, perhaps, if the past had been entirely monstrous. But love, even when rationed so stingily it left one starved, still left marks. I did not deny those memories their existence. I simply refused to let them outweigh the years of longing met with silence, of celebrations diminished to footnotes, of needs met with empty promises. I could hold both truths, that there had been moments of care, and that there had been a lifetime of disregard. And in holding both, I chose which would guide my steps forward. One evening, about a week before the wedding, I sat alone at the kitchen table, The invitation list spread before me like a map charting the geography of my heart. Each name inscribed was a testament to survival, to resilience, to a love that had not needed blood ties to be real, to be fierce, to be enduring. Friends who had shown up when no one else did, mentors who had seen potential when I could barely lift my own head. Daniel's family, who had embraced me not as an outsider, but as someone intrinsically worthy of belonging. I thought about the spaces left unfilled, the parents who would not sit in the front row, the faces that would not smile at me from the altar. And I realized, with a pang more bittersweet than sorrowful, that their absence was not a void. It was space reclaimed, space for laughter unshadowed by judgment, for joy untainted by conditional affection. I penned a final private vow that night, a promise to the girl who had waited so long to be seen, that I would never again prioritize the comfort of others over my own dignity, that I would never again diminish my worth to fit into spaces too small to contain the full breadth of who I was becoming. And as the clock ticked past midnight, ushering in another day closer to the moment I would stand before Daniel and vow to choose love without fear, I felt the past finally begin to loosen its grip. I was not healed entirely. Perhaps I never would be. But I was whole enough to stand, to love, to build, to dream. The morning of the wedding arrived, not with the dramatic crescendo I had once imagined, but with a stillness so profound it felt as though even the universe was holding its breath in reverence. The sky was painted in gentle strokes of pink and gold, the kind of fragile, fleeting beauty that demanded silent awe. As I lay in bed, the silk sheets cool against my skin, I allowed myself a rare moment of absolute stillness, drinking in the quiet certainty that today, the life I had so carefully, painfully built would take center stage, no longer overshadowed by the ghosts of a family that had mistaken presence for love. Lena arrived just after dawn, arms full of coffee and pastries and an energy so fiercely buoyant it felt like a lifeline. She burst into the room with a chaotic grace, scattering laughter and promises of a perfect day like confetti. Behind her came the rest of the bridal party, women who had become sisters not through blood, but through battle, through late-night phone calls, through shoulders offered without question, through celebrations and griefs, and every messy, beautiful thing in between. We transformed the bridal suite into a sanctuary of color and warmth, the air thick with the scent of fresh flowers and the low, soothing hum of familiar voices. Makeup brushes danced across skin, laughter spilled soda. Memories were stitched into the fabric of the day without fanfare. And beneath it all, a river of quiet, relentless joy carried me forward, its current undeniable. As the minutes bled into hours, a gentle, inevitable tension began to coil in the corners of the room. It was subtle at first, a tightness in Lena's smile, a flicker of unease in the way someone's hand hesitated over a mascara wand. I noticed it, tucked it away like a thorn I was not ready to pull free. It wasn't until Lena pulled me aside, her fingers curling around my wrist with a gentleness that belied the storm in her eyes, that I understood. "They're here," she said, her voice low and strained, as though speaking the words aloud might give them more power. "Your parents, they showed up." For a moment, the world narrowed to a single shuddering heartbeat. I could feel the blood rushing to my ears, a roaring tide that threatened to drown out everything else. I had not prepared for this, had not dared to imagine they would cross a threshold I had so clearly marked. Part of me, the old part, the broken part, recoiled, panic flaring like a wounded animal. Another part, the stronger part, the part I had spent years forging in fire and solitude, stood tall. I took a slow, deliberate breath, grounding myself in the present, in the reality that this day, this life, was mine, not theirs to claim or derail. "Where are they?" I asked, my voice steady, almost detached. "They're outside the venue," Lena said, talking to the event coordinator. "They're insisting they have a right to be here." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the fury and the sadness and the old, weary longing wash over me, and then recede like a tide. When I opened them, I was clear, resolute. "They are not welcome," I said simply. "Not today. Not anymore." Lena nodded, fierce and loyal to the core. "I'll take care of it." As she swept from the room, a whirlwind of righteous indignation in heels and hairspray, I turned back to the mirror. My reflection stared back at me. Not the girl who had once wept silently in empty auditoriums, not the teenager who had swallowed disappointment like broken glass, not the young woman who had measured her worth by the crumbs of attention thrown her way. No, this woman was something entirely different. She was a testament to survival, to self-rescue, to the unyielding, unstoppable reclamation of a life once given away in pieces. I slipped into my dress with reverence, each movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. The lace whispered against my skin. The fabric molded to my body as though it had been waiting all this time to find its rightful home. Around me, the room buzzed with activity, but within me, there was only a profound, unshakable stillness. I was exactly where I was meant to be, exactly who I was meant to be. When Lena returned, there was a triumphant glint in her eye. "They've been escorted off the property," she said, the satisfaction in her voice barely tempered by the solemnity of the moment. "They didn't go quietly, but they went." I nodded, feeling an ache in my chest that was not sadness, not exactly. It was the ache of setting down a burden so long carried it had become a second skin. It was the ache of choosing oneself over the illusions of what could never be. The ceremony itself unfolded like a dream woven from threads of gold and laughter. As I walked down the aisle, every step felt like a reclamation, a declaration that I was not the sum of someone else's neglect. I was my own creation, my own salvation. Daniel waited for me at the altar, his eyes filled with a love so pure, so unwavering, that it stole the breath from my lungs. We spoke our vows in voices thick with emotion, promises forged not in naive idealism, but in the crucible of real, hard-earned understanding. We knew what it meant to choose each other, not because it was easy or convenient, but because it was deliberate, because it was necessary, because it was right. As the officiant pronounced us husband and wife and the room erupted into applause, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Not the absence of my parents, not the validation of the crowd, but the sheer, exhilarating freedom of knowing I had chosen this life, and it had chosen me back. The reception was a blur of music and laughter and the clinking of glasses, a celebration not just of a marriage, but of a metamorphosis. I moved through the evening with a kind of lightness I had never known, dancing, laughing, embracing the people who had shown up for me, not out of obligation, but out of love. There were moments, of course, when the shadow of the day's earlier confrontation tried to creep back in. A glance toward the empty seats reserved for parents, a fleeting thought of how different it could have been if they had been different. But I refused to let those shadows claim more space than they deserved. They were merely echoes, and I was living, breathing, radiant reality. Later, much later, after the last song had played and the last sparkler had burned down to embers, Daniel and I found ourselves alone under the vast, starlit sky. The air was cool and crisp, the world hushed as though holding its breath in reverence for what had been witnessed. He pulled me into his arms, resting his forehead against mine, his hands warm against the small of my back. "You were incredible today," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "You are incredible." I closed my eyes, letting his words seep into the deepest, most wounded parts of me, letting them stitch shut wounds that had been raw and gaping for far too long. "We're incredible," I whispered back, the truth of it filling me to overflowing. We stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other in the silence, the stars spinning lazy circles overhead. And truly the first time I did not feel like a backup plan, a consolation prize, an afterthought. I felt like the beating heart of a life I had chosen, a life that had chosen me, a life that was mine. But I knew even then that the journey was not over. Healing was not a straight line, and old wounds had a way of whispering from the shadows. My parents were not finished trying to claw their way back into a life they had forfeited through their own actions. There would be more calls, more accusations, more carefully crafted narratives, where they were the wounded victims, and I, the heartless betrayer. But I also knew this. I was no longer the girl who would crumble at their disappointment, no longer the woman who would contort herself into shapes designed to fit someone else's broken mold. I was a flame that would not be snuffed out, a force that would not be diminished. And when they came, and I knew they would come, I would be ready. The first few weeks after the wedding slipped past like pages fluttering in a warm breeze. the days filled with a kind of quiet, radiant joy that I had once believed existed only in other people's stories. Daniel and I moved through those early days of marriage with a kind of reverence for the life we had fought to claim, savoring every small, tender moment. The way sunlight pooled on our kitchen floor in the mornings, the sleepy laughter shared over tangled sheets and forgotten alarms, the simple, astonishing miracle of waking up next to someone who chose me, freely and fully, each and every day. And yet, beneath the joy, I could feel it, the gathering storm, the inevitable reckoning waiting just beyond the fragile peace we had built. The calls from my parents came daily at first, a relentless drumbeat of voicemails and text messages that ranged from pleading to furious to self-pitying. I ignored them, resolute, but the weight of their persistence hung over me like an unwelcome specter, souring even the sweetest moments with its looming presence. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when the final confrontation arrived, not in the form of another ignored phone call or a guilt-laden email, but in person. I was leaving the bookstore down the street, a paper bag filled with new novels tucked under one arm, when I saw them. My parents, standing beside their car across the parking lot, their faces drawn and closed against the chill mist of the rain. For a heartbeat I froze, my body caught between the old instincts to flee and the new strength that had been tempered in fires they would never comprehend. I could have turned away. I could have walked back inside, waited them out, allowed my absence to speak once more where words had always failed. But something inside me shifted, a quiet resolve settling into my bones. This was my life now, and I would no longer live it hiding from the wreckage they had left behind. I squared my shoulders and crossed the lot toward them, every step a silent act of rebellion, of reclamation. As I approached, I saw the familiar flicker of emotions in their eyes. Anger, hurt, confusion. The same worn dance they had performed for years, as though baffled by the consequences of their own actions. My mother spoke first, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "How could you do this to us?" she demanded, her words sharp and brittle as icicles. "How could you get married without your family?" I met her gaze steadily, unflinching. "I didn't get married without my family," I said softly. "I got married with the people who loved and supported me. You weren't there because you chose not to be there long before the wedding." My father scoffed, the sound harsh and ugly in the damp air. "You're punishing us for mistakes we made years ago. We were busy. We had responsibilities." The old wound flared, a ghost of pain that no longer had the power to gut me, only to remind me of how far I had come. "I understand that now," I said. "You always had more important things. I just finally realized I deserved to be important too." My mother's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of anger, not remorse. "You're our daughter," she cried. "You owe us respect." For a long, quiet moment, I simply stood there, feeling the rain seep into my hair, cold and real against the heat of my skin. I thought of every recital, every birthday, every milestone met with absence and indifference. I thought of the way they had shown up only when it served their image, when it was convenient, when it cost them nothing. "I don't owe you my happiness," I said at last, my voice quiet but unshakable. "I don't owe you a place in my life just because you share my blood. Respect is earned. Love is earned. You taught me that, even if you didn't mean to." My father's face darkened, a flush of fury rising up his neck, but I did not look away. I stood firm, anchored in the truth I had fought so long to claim. They could rage, they could plead, they could drown in the stories they told themselves about what kind of parents they had been. But they could no longer touch the life I had built beyond their reach. Without another word, I turned and walked away, the finality of it ringing louder than any shouted goodbye. I did not run. I did not falter. I simply walked forward, each step shedding another layer of old hurt, another chain I had long mistaken for love. By the time I reached home, Daniel was waiting for me, a silent sentinel of understanding and patience. I collapsed into his arms, not in defeat but in triumph. The tears that came cleansing, not wounding. I told him everything, every word, every look, every poisoned accusation, and he listened the way he always did, with his whole heart, without interruption or judgment. "They're not going to stop," I said finally, my voice raw but steady. They'll rewrite the story however they need to in their minds. Make me the villain. Paint themselves as victims. Daniel kissed the crown of my head, his arms tightening around me. Let them, he said simply. You know the truth. The people who matter know the truth. You don't have to carry their version anymore. And he was right. I had spent so much of my life trying to edit myself to fit their narrative, shrinking, twisting, erasing parts of myself in the desperate hope that maybe this time I would be enough. But no more. I was done living in the margins of someone else's story. I was writing my own now, every messy, glorious, imperfect chapter of it. In the months that followed, the calls dwindled, the emails ceased, the ghostly presence of my parents in my life finally fading into the background noise where it belonged. Occasionally, a well-meaning relative would reach out, trying to broker peace, trying to stitch together what had never truly been whole. I met those efforts with kindness, but with unyielding boundaries. I did not reopen the door I had closed. Some things, once healed, must remain sealed. Daniel and I built our life slowly, deliberately, each brick laid with intention and love. We traveled, laughing over shared maps and inside jokes. We fought sometimes, as all couples do, but even our arguments were rooted in respect, in a fundamental recognition of each other's worth. We dreamed of a future filled with possibility, a home filled with warmth, a family built not on obligation but on choice, on unconditional love. And when eventually we welcomed a daughter into our lives, I held her in my arms and made a silent vow that she would never have to earn my love, that she would never know the hollow ache of wondering if she mattered. She would grow up bathed in a love so fierce, so unwavering, that she would never question her place in this world. Looking into her bright, curious eyes, I understood with a bone-deep certainty that the cycle had been broken, that the legacy of neglect and invisibility would end with me, that she would inherit a world where she was always, irrevocably, the priority. I taught her that love is not something you beg for. It is something you deserve simply by existing. And as the years unfolded, as gray crept into my hair and laugh lines deepened around my eyes, I carried with me the quiet, fierce pride of a life lived on my own terms. I carried with me the girl who had once waited in vain for people who would never come, honoring her by never waiting again. I had not just survived. I had flourished. And in the end, that was the truest, most beautiful victory of all.